Welcome. Thank you so much for attending our panel discussion this afternoon, Designing for a Brave New World, where we will talk about the invisible impact of design. I am your event chair, Jillian Potts. I'm also one of the co-VPs of Student Affairs for the IIDA SoCal chapter and a product rep for Milliken. First and foremost, we'd like to always thank our chapter sponsors for 2020 for their continued support. At the patron level, ECC and Tangram. At the donor level, ARPR, Herman Miller, Geiger, HBC, Pivot, SPC, Steelcase, Taslimi, Technion. At the friend level, Arcadia, Encore, Crossville, Emser, Knoll, Fiandre, EW, Garrett, Hayworth, Metropolitan West, Pier Hatch, Milliken, and OFS. And always our design partners, AECOM, Gensler, HOK, Oculus, and Walcott. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our sponsor for this event specifically, Herman Miller. And before I introduce our moderator, I just want to note that as the panelists have their discussion here in just a moment, I'm sure you're gonna have questions, things you may wanna ask them. The way we're gonna handle that is we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. At the bottom of your Zoom function bar, there is a little button that says Q&A. That's where you should be typing your questions, not in the chat feature, but in the Q&A section. So without further ado, I will introduce our moderator, Melissa Steach. Melissa is a best-selling author and award-winning fine artist with accreditations in positive psychology interventions as well as ergonomic assessment. She is also a member of the Office Ergonomics Research Committee and holds a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. Melissa returned to school mid-career to create a life that would satisfy her passion for helping companies develop workplace cultures that enhance, empower, and engage their employees for the betterment of everyone. This holistic view, inclusive of the human, built, and intangible environments, is her definition of workplace well-being. So with that, I will hand this off to Melissa to introduce our discussion today.
Hey, thank you, Jillian, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in this afternoon. And I have the honor of moderating this fantastic panel. I had such a good time getting to know them, and I would like to share with you their bios really quickly. I'll start with Jessica Cooper, who is the Chief Commercial Officer for the International Well-Building Institute. The IWBI is leading the global movement to transform our buildings and communities in ways that help people thrive. With a background in design, Jessica is passionate about leveraging the power of design to realize human and environmental sustainability outcomes. Accordingly, her work at IWBI brings health-focused design and policy solutions to diverse buildings and human environments around the globe. Leveraging scientific evidence and research, Jessica helps clients both quantify the value of healthy buildings and develop technical solutions for implementing the well building standard. Sarah Crutchfield is a store design manager for Starbucks, handling the Northeast region. Prior to Starbucks, she worked in retail architecture with a boutique firm in New York City and Callison RTKL in Dallas, as well as New York City. Sarah loves traveling when the world allows, and I've peeped her Instagram, so she's been traveling domestically, and she enjoys a few too many espressos a day. That's probably how she gets around so fast. Kasia Murray is a senior project designer, project manager at Pacific 33 Architects in San Diego, and has worked in design for over 13 years. Pacific 33 Architects specializes in healthcare design and focuses on creating functional and healing environments for not only patients and family, but also staff. She holds a BA in interior design from Purdue University and a BA in psychology from the UC Riverside. Her enthusiasm for design and working with others has been an ongoing passion that she hopes will last a lifetime. Riz Walker is Blitz Los Angeles' studio leader. She is a multi-skill designer and strategist with 10+ years of expertise in the implementation of urban design thinking to interior design, specifically workplace interiors and campuses. Her diverse background in research-based design and its integration into the development and construction of projects. She knows how to identify clients' goals and develop design strategies to reflect design intent, budget, spatial, and programmatic requirements. All right, so this is a really happening panel, and I'm excited to get going here. And with that, I want to open up with just stating that part of how this came about is that I think a lot of us feel this way, and please feel free to put in the Q&A box if you just want to comment on this, but we're in the midst of an existential reckoning, right? Both personally and collectively. It started out with it just being about COVID, but really we've got a lot going on. We've got the pandemic, we've got protest, we've got economic downturns, all sorts of anything that can be hit, we could be hit with at once. It seems that we are collectively being hit with it. And then when we think about our own microcosms, right, in the places that we live and the people with whom we're coveting with, right, there's a lot of layers. There are a lot of things going on, and this is why we wanted to talk about the invisible impact of design, because so much of what we talk about, so much of what's trending, are the things that you can see, and arguably. For all of you designers, you know that there are lots of things that affect us in a way that if we know what to look for, we can see the thing, right? But so often, most of us who are not in the industry, we're not the magicians. We don't see the magic. We don't understand how the sleight of hand works or why we feel the way that we do or we're behaving the way that we do. And so it's important for us to remember that these things that these buildings, these environments that we build, they're not only just facilitators, they're conduits. They don't just hold space as a facilitator. They conduct energy as a conduit. They're a vessel for some of them, for probably all of the most important events in our lives to some degree. So with that, I want to open up to the entire panel and ask them, and whomever, please, any of you go first, but what design elements do you consider invisible in your area design, and how have they or their purpose changed during COVID? And since I see Sarah smiling, Sarah, I'll ask you to jump in.
Yeah, well, so I'm Sarah Crutchfield. I work for Starbucks. And I think directly relevant to the pandemic, Melissa and I were having a chat about people returning to something that felt familiar. And Starbucks was one of those places that was fortunate as a retailer to be able to maintain being open in a safe way, because we have different channels, right? We have mobile order and we have drive-through. And a lot of people would, with all the disruption going on, would maintain their routine of going to Starbucks. And I think there's something that's comfortable about that. And there's something that's inherent in the design. And, we could get into all of the things that each of us designers do when we're designing an individual store to create a third place space. But I think ultimately, something that's invisible within Starbucks is a feeling of safety and a feeling of community. And that's something that if our customers don't feel that, we know that we've missed the mark. And so we'll actually go back and redesign and renovate stores sooner if we feel like, the feedback isn't there and the budget supports it.
Yeah, I think you touched on something that that I think a lot about in design in general, and especially now living in a pandemic world, and that's how space makes you feel. And it's not just a feeling of safety, but it could also be a feeling of being able to innovate or to think thoughtfully with each other or to think thoughtfully by yourself. But how are you using design as a tool in order to initiate different types of feelings throughout the spaces that you're designing, so that you're creating a range of feelings throughout that space?
Yeah, what do you think? I'm thinking of a statement that Kasia shared, and she talked about one of her favorite elements or invisible elements of design. And I think, Kasia, I'll speak on your behalf and correct me if I'm wrong. I think this statement came out of you having studied psychology also, is that you love caring for the staff through design, because I think I wrote it down as nurse leads to mood, leads to care of patient, right? And we could extrapolate that. We could extend that to be to a client, to a client of Riz's, people in the workplace, to a customer in Starbucks, to a patient in a healthcare facility. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. You know, in our office, we always kind of, when we're starting out the whole planning phase, we always think about what can we do for the staff? Because a lot of times staff gets forgotten in these facilities. We say, well, you know, they're lucky to have a job, so we're not going to worry about that. But ultimately, the staff is the front line that's going to help create that, in our case with healthcare, patient experience, and as well as customer experience. If the staff is happy, it's like that expression, if mama's happy, everybody's happy. If staff is happy, hopefully that's going to trickle down to making the visit from a patient or a customer or a family member, make that a lot easier. Because in our case with healthcare, it builds up some kind of anxiety. You know, not everybody is all happy-go-lucky when it comes to going to see the doctor. And we have to really think about what are the small things that we can do that's going to help make that just a little bit easier. And in some cases, it is taking into account what the staff needs. How are they going to be able to perform more effectively and efficiently? And if they're in the right mindset, that's going to help how the patients or the customers should be treated to make that experience a little more enjoyable, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does would anyone else like to share about their favorite invisible design element? Thank you, Kasia.
I can add to the sort of flavor around how design can make you feel, with also something that we think about a lot at the International Well Building Institute is how design can impact your behavior. And we think a lot about how we can use design to make the healthy choice the easy choice, which I think is something that's showing up quite a bit in the context of this pandemic. Signage and or markings on the floor, for example, that indicate what is an appropriate distance to keep from others who you may be around, or making personal protective equipment or hand washing stations more accessible and located in places where people will use them to be most effective. So really thinking about how design impacts behavior, often those are visible elements that people aren't necessarily aware that they've been designed in a way to support a healthier behavior. So I think that's really interesting. And then there are, of course, some elements that we've been thinking about a lot in the context of the pandemic, which are truly invisible. Air quality, for example, and all of the design strategies that get put into place to make air quality better, which could be anything from the ventilation system to operable windows to additional filtration devices that have been put in. And that's obviously becoming, it's coming to the fore of many different organizations and building operators right now as to how they can then impact those things in the time of COVID. So a little less sexy, if you will, sort of the mechanical systems in the building, but equally as important in terms of promoting health. And I think right now it's about making those invisible elements of the building visible in some way to get back to that feeling of safety, right? People are looking for an indication that their air quality has been optimized to the extent possible, or cleaning processes have been put into place to make the building safer, and so on and so forth. So making those invisible elements visible is becoming more and more important.
You know, you make a really good point, because from a psychological and even an ergonomics perspective, lots of studies have shown that perceived pain is experienced the exact same way as tangible pain, right? And so, you know, when we think about when I think about what the WELL standard is and how really in some ways the organization is held accountable for adhering to certain guidelines to take care of the staff. And so it really makes sure that the entire ecosystem is thinking from a wellness or well-being perspective. And in regard to the perceived safety, you know, I'd like to ask the group, in regard to infection control, can you make that aesthetically appealing? You know, you mentioned that it's not sexy. Can we make it sexy? Do we want to make it sexy? Is it as effective? Is it, if it's pretty? I don't know. You guys are the expert. Tell us. Anyone hop in?
I mean, I think any design can be created in different ways that are aesthetically pleasing. I don't think that we can just say if we're designing for a pandemic, then it's going to be ugly.
Yeah.
So I'd like to shut that down immediately.
Well, and maybe I can clarify when I mean not sexy. It's like people don't necessarily like to spend a lot of time talking about, their mechanical system, but it's a
Yeah.
critically important system within their building. And I think right now the evaluation is, do I have infrastructure in place to accommodate higher ventilation rates or better filtration? If yes, great, let's ramp those up. And then maybe we create some good signage and or communication protocols to let people know about that. But again, sort of going with the air quality theme, there are some beautiful, arguably, at least really sleek, standalone air purifier devices that people can purchase now for their homes, their home offices, and potentially even for their workspaces, spaces, retail stores, and so on and so forth. And so I think design comes into play not only in terms of interiors, but also products as well. And there are some really great ways to accommodate these things. Another one I really like, getting back to sort of cleaning and sanitization, again, not the sexiest thing to talk about, but if you design sleek surfaces that are more easily cleaned, that can be really helpful, especially during this time. And also one of the other strategies that's being put into place is sort of minimizing clutter. So things like shared surfaces can be cleaned more regularly. I'm sure that shows up in healthcare settings as a best practice all the time. But less clutter can also lead to a more aesthetically pleasing and supportive environment as well. So I think there are some good examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really about a holistic approach as well. I think that if we start to silo some of these things that we need to maybe lean more into because of this reaction of the pandemic world, that if we think about it all together and we're, designing this new type of mechanical system at the same time that we're maybe doing the schematic layout of the physical space design. And then we're also thinking through, how will the cleaning team be able to move through this space in an effective way and throughout the day, not just maybe late at night, but throughout the day, so that people see that the space is being cleaned and they're feeling that sense of safety. So that, I think that there needs to be a different level of communication across design partners. And then also maybe setting up a larger plan for the client team or the end user team and that facilities team, right, that is going to then take over that space and really understand how to maintain it in this deeper way that maybe they normally would have before this.
That's a great point. And I know Sarah wanted to jump in and say something as well.
I was just going to say, I mean, I have the fortunate perspective of working for the client, and we've been on the front lines trying to figure out how to handle this, right? So design is partnering with facilities, is partnering with construction to kind of just get anything out into the field at the beginning. And now we're really able to lead with it, right? So, Starbucks has always been a brand that has been, when it comes to energy efficiency, we've built all of our stores LEED for years. We kind of try to take that higher road approach when it comes to things like that. But this is dictating a lot of our design and our solves moving forward. And so when you asked about, can it be sexy or can it be nicer? I am so thankful in some ways that this happened, because there's so much junk in our stores. It's eliminating some of it, or it's controlling it. And, it's influencing our building design. When we're working with landlords, we're adding in walk-up windows where we can. And we always try to maximize a car stack and a drive-through, but these are all things that have become imperative now that customer behavior is changing. And so it is directly affecting our design, but my job is to make it beautiful. And when you have the control over it and when it's not reactionary, then you can start, like Jessica was saying, I can design an incredible HVAC system and have the most beautiful linear diffusers that no one sees, and they walk into a space and they feel comfortable temperature wise, and they can tell that the air is good and breathable, and they don't see it. So that's kind of the end goal, right?
Yeah. So I'd like to ask a question to kind of expand a little bit beyond thinking, because we're thinking of, designing a brave new world. So if we think about expanding beyond just thinking about virus or pandemic, or even just virus control, we think about the rioting that no one really saw coming from, and different sorts of issues there. What about, or any sort, I mean, if we think about folks who live along the West Coast, earthquake preparedness, I feel like there are a lot of things that we're thinking about, or maybe should be thinking about from a design perspective, in terms of unforeseen elements that go beyond the scope of what we can just imagine. You know, we prepare for earthquakes, we prepare for this, but are your clients talking about designing differently? Just my brother, for instance, works at Goyard. You know, the day they boarded up their store, and they were one of the few stores left untouched. You know, are companies thinking about this sort of thing? Protection of not just employees, but protection of property. And how are we designing for that, perhaps? And Sarah, you don't have, anyone can pipe in. You're just on the screen. And maybe no one's talking about it. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I mean, from a perspective of an organization that writes standards to help improve health and well-being so that people can thrive, our mission is always to be thinking more holistically and providing solutions that can help stop crises or challenges as they arrive, but also be more preventative in supporting health and well-being in the long term. And even when we pivoted our plans for 2020, arguably, in terms of the programs that we were going to focus on and the products that we were going to launch and all of that to really respond to COVID-19 and utilize our internal expertise and the expertise of our partners to help our clients respond to COVID-19, what we created was the Well Health Safety Rating. And it was important to us to think about health safety issues more broadly than the pandemic that we're dealing with today, which is specific to infectious diseases, right? Mm-hmm. So the health safety rating actually looks at all of the strategies that can be implemented through operations and policies that can help protect against acute health issues, so immediate and severe health threats, one of which is arguably the pandemic, an infectious disease or a virus, but also looking at strategies that can support people in the future if they're dealing with other environmental threats, technological threats, or even other health threats that may arise in the future. So even with a product that was sort of designed in the time of COVID, we were thinking more holistically about really making buildings and organizations more resilient to health issues that might arise in the future. The last thing I'll say is that we've been inspired, really, I would say, and humbled too, that the health safety rating seems to have opened up quite a few new conversations for us around how a holistic program like WELL can support health and well-being strategies in the long term. And so sort of the health safety rating is sort of bringing new organizations and individuals into our network, into our community, so that they can deploy our evidence-based strategies. But we're finding that especially large organizations that have the ability to think about this right now, they are not only thinking about the pandemic, but they're also saying, wow, we could have been more prepared for this. Mm-hmm. How do we not only get through this time, but think through ways to be more resilient through more preventative measures in the future? So even engagement in our holistic approach has been pretty active over the last couple of months, which I think is inspiring to think about the fact that it is a broader focus on health and well-being and not necessarily a specific need to address the current crisis at hand.
I think that's smart. And I really, when I think about this a lot, especially in terms of how the environment is changing and how we're getting more earthquakes and more hurricanes, and these are having bigger effects on our built environment and our human environment. And, the word that comes to my mind is both patience and agility. I think that, when something happens that's unexpected, whether it be a pandemic or an earthquake or a nor'easter or flood, you have to be able to be reactive, but you also have to be able to be patient with the understanding that you may not totally have all the things that you need at that moment. And I think that really stems with, having those conversations early on, at least in the built environment, right? Like when we're going into a historic building in downtown LA and starting to think about that retrofit of what it can become, turning it from one use to another. We also need to think about how is that exiting strategy changing? How are we updating all of the structural and mechanical systems, but also the exiting systems for, thinking about the safety of the people who are in those spaces. And then also then thinking about the safety of those humans in those spaces in terms of air quality and, what are the things what's that peeling paint on the wall or that mold on the wall that I think looks so beautiful, but could also, create some air quality problems. So I think that it's not only the conversations that happen in the design team or even the end user team. I think that it's us all sitting around, again, communication, all being around the table, all thinking about this and being thought leaders in what we understand and what we know. I mean, I think the worst thing that as an architect or as a designer we could ever do is just follow the building code to follow the building code, but not really understand why we're following it or why it was written in the first place. I mean, same with well or lead, right? Like we understand what these things are, and we understand why that those regulations have been made, but we also need to go beyond that and have that just be the standard. The standard shouldn't be to just hit this gold mark or the silver mark or whatever. We need to understand why we're doing that, and it's because of the long term.
So, I think that's a really great point. And I want to ask Kasia, because being a healthcare designer, there are some things that a lot of us, right, collectively, are just now thinking about. But I would imagine healthcare is always thinking about this from multiple levels, right? What happens to people who are in the middle of surgery and an earthquake hits, or they're on a ventilator, I mean, and I'm not making light of that, forgive me, but just, there are these things that happen in life. And Kasia, what have you seen, for you, what about the invisible elements of design that were pertinent before, but maybe that you see as maybe need to be expanded or are even more important now going forward with what we know, just from your learned perspective?
Right. Well, with healthcare, we do come across more restrictions than other sectors. In some cases, we deal with OSHPD, which is the Health and Planning and Development, and things can get pretty stringent, such as pendants. You guys will laugh at this, but you have to have rigid pendants that if you're going to have some close together, they need to be on a rigid stem instead of a cord, which there's some very beautiful pendants with cords out there that you go perfect in that space. So, but you understand why that rule is in place, because if there's going to be an earthquake, that's the last thing you want to worry about is glass shattering and making it difficult for patients and staff to exit. One of the bigger things too is as we're developing that space plan is kind of, as you hit on this, is following those restrictions or codes that they put in place for life safety. Because, a few times you'll get a little pushback from the client like, oh, no, we need to get 50 people in here. Well, technically we can only have 25. And they're saying, but no, it'll be okay. What we're trying to tell them is that if in the event of an emergency, you're not going to want to have those 50 people on there. You're gonna want to deal with the 25. So it gets a little tough, but I think it helps us to that protocol. It gives us a protocol to follow in the end for when these things happen. I mean, while we cannot plan for the future, which in some cases is the fun part, but also the scary part. I think nobody knew a pandemic was coming, at least in our lifetime. And the thing about that is that I think if we focus on planning for the worst, we're going to lose a little bit of why we design, that creative process.
That's a really good point.
And so while, yes, we want to be proactive, I think in some cases we do end up being reactive. And hopefully right now we've learned a significant part of what happens when a global pandemic occurs and how we need to react the next time it happens. So it really is kind of that gray area.
You bring up something, and I posed it, I'm posing it as delight, but you're talking about, I mean, we're all designers, a lot of people, we're in this field because we love beauty. We love the beauty that we can create and the beauty that we can see. And there are two points to this question, and I hope to hear from everyone and talk about it, how you feel. But there are two things. There is convincing the clients that the intangible, the invisible elements matter, because they're not always the the quantifiable ones. There are qualitative ones. You know, they're the ones that will add up eventually, right? There's a tipping point where those things that we can't see, it tips over, right? And we can begin to measure a little bit. And arguably we can certainly measure a lot more now than we were before in terms of mood or, you know, states of mind and pressure in the back. And we can watch with wayfinding and heat maps and see how people do and how they work within the space. But you know, trying to convince a client of the difference between, I think, Riz, you talked about this once before, adapt versus change. And then also being sure to hold on to the very thing, Kasia, that you're mentioning, which is why you became a designer in the first place, or why you're an architect in the first place, is the beauty component, right? So I don't even know where my question is going here. I'm just opening it up and say, can we talk about tough clients, right? And can we talk about our purpose for doing what we do and how we can continue to do that in a way that is responsible?
I can start.
I'll take this.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
So my background is in retail architecture solely, and previously to being in-house, I was at firms that, you know, would design complete RFPs for different retail clients. And what drew me to retail was I loved how measurable the effects of design were. So there's research to show that if a customer walks into a retail store and they can touch a piece of clothing, that if they try it on, the turnover rate starts to multiply. It's like 10%, then it goes to like 70% if they try it on. If they pass by something, if they can touch it, there's all these things, there's metrics. And so there's research that you can say, we need to design the store in a way and create a customer journey that allows people to pass by certain things, that makes things accessible. You don't want things too high. You need a feature, you need something for your brain to focus on. There's science and there's psychology behind it. And in retail, I mean, that generates sales, right? So that's an easier conversation to have. But I think the more that we understand the psychology and the science behind it, the better we can be at explaining to tough clients why they should do it. The harder conversation for me is like the budget things. That to me, explaining why we need to do something is easy because there's research to back it up. And then when you asked about, you know, kind of what you delight in, I see all of this as an opportunity. Like if there's something that's not pretty, that like, I mean, I go crazy over exit signs, right? That they have to be everywhere. There has to be a fire strobe, and that stuff drives me crazy. And then I remember when I was studying abroad, I'm walking through the Uffizi in Florence, and I'm like, I don't see an exit sign. Like if there's a fire, I have no idea where to go. I have absolutely no idea how to get out of here. And it makes you realize the value in it, right? And so things like that, when I always understood that the purpose was great, but I'll try to take a look and see. I mean, I'm not personally redesigning exit signs, but if there are things that are ugly that are required to be in a space, I see it as an opportunity of like, maybe we can work together and we can create something, and I can kind of put my mark on it and make it how I want it to be, versus how it should have been or was in the past.
Yeah, for me, it's really about storytelling. Like when you're thinking about or when you're getting ready to present to a client, I think that it's really important to know why you're doing that. And a lot of that plays back to the very beginning of your first touch point with them, and really being a listener and understanding why they even want to have this new space, or what the purpose is, and who's going to be involved, and not just doing the programming, but also the discovery of what it is and who they are. And all of that builds into this concept. And so by the time that you have that concept, that initial big idea, it's so solid, and it already is so ingrained in your own heart, right? I'm going to get super emotional because that's just like what design is for me. But you feel it. And so then you go into that room, and And it's not about explaining where the TV goes on the wall or where the exit sign is. It's about explaining how the space is going to feel and explaining how you're going to move through that space, and how the interactions that are going to be created, or the overlaps of all of these different work types. And when you walk around this corner, it's going to open up and you're going to see this wellness space, and there's going to be all of these tingly lights from the wall or from the ceiling. And like that to me gets me really excited. And I think also, if you feel the design, your client is going to feel it through you. And that's the, like, quote unquote best sales pitch, I think, because it's not technically a sales pitch. It's just, it's flowing from you in this other, untouchable way, I guess. And I think for me, design isn't necessarily about the beauty of the object or of the thing. It's, does it really make you feel something? My favorite type of architecture is brutalism, and I think it's because it really like smacks you in the face when you walk into a brutalist building of how you're supposed to feel. And usually it's like this very dominating feeling of this really enclosed moment, and then it opens up and there's this like one moment of light, but you're seeing all the rawness of the concrete. And I don't know, that to me has always been really inspiring. And I think about that whenever I'm starting a new project of, what's the goal of how the space wants to feel, and how all of these different programs are going to create one big feeling for that moment.
Thank you. Jessica or Kasia, would you like to share, or should I'll continue if not.
My favorite delight thing, which, I think is just, it's not necessarily a segue from anything that Riz or Sarah have said, but I love irresistible stairs. Basically stairs that draw you in and make you want to like bounce up them to the extent that you're able, of course. It's just like such a great design feature that is in some ways invisible. People don't necessarily realize that those stairs are drawing them in, but there's ways that stairs can be designed that just invites people to move and be active. And I think there are other examples of that as well, sort of, again, getting back to that, make the healthy choice the easy choice. But I just love when I happen upon an irresistible stair in a building that is like, you can see that it's a place of community and convening and chance encounters, but also movement and activity and health. So I'll throw that in there as a delightful feature that.
I love that.
Yeah, I agree. So then how has this disruption been good for the architecture and design community? How do you think, someone asked how we felt all of this could really extend not just the buzzword or the talk around mental, emotional, spiritual, physical well-being, but really indoctrinate us in that and really make that a standard in how we design. How do you think this disruption can lead to a more consideration of those elements that get a lot of talk but not a lot of action, so to speak?
Well, it gives them more weight. I mean, if we go back to this idea of research-based design, if now we know that those things are important in a quantitative way. And so when we have those conversations with our clients, like you were saying, Sarah, if you can walk into a room and have some data behind what you're proposing, then it's more apt to get sign off, because someone who isn't necessarily an ethereal designer and just thinking in this three-dimensional space and how that might feel, but it's, it relates to the numbers person at the table, or it relates to the HR person at the table that's really focused on how their teams are going to operate better and be happier in their spaces.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I think it also pushes us as designers to get out of our comfort zone. I mean, I think we all have this is our go-to, you've got a short time frame on a project and it's like, all right, what do we use there? What do we do here? Let's do that, roll it out. But I think what it does is it keeps us on our toes. Unfortunately, not that global pandemic to do that, but it makes us have to be more in the know. I think we get millions of emails a week of new products, and many times you're just scanning right over those. Now it's like, okay, I really need to take a minute because there may be some products out there now that are going to benefit us uh, with our future planning. I mean, I was just at project. I walked in and it was kind of like there's a thermometer that's on this makeshift stand that, I need to lean in and get my forehead read. Then there's plexiglass that's kind of just drilled in, not very nicely. And I look at that, I'm like, okay, well, if this is the route that we're going, what can we do to make that run a little more flush with the design and not look like an afterthought? And it's hard because we don't know how long this is going to last, and is it going to last? And so I think some of our clients are a little bit on the fence on whether do we just do the temporary fix right now and we still plan like this is going to go away, or do we start changing things now? And so what we're trying to do in our office, we're scrambling, trying to figure out, okay, how can we be a little more flexible in our design, but still maintain brand that they have had, design that they have had, the design that they keep coming back to us for. So.
The other piece I think is customer behavior and how that's going to change after this. So even if COVID does go away, who's to say that the behavior won't be forever altered? And so we're seeing that in our digital space with mobile order. We didn't have a large percentage of our sales in a lot of stores going to mobile order. And now our cafe sales are 10% in a lot of drive-through stores. So combined mobile order and drive-through, that's dictating the way that we design, and it's dictating the spaces that real estate chooses. And it's changed everything. And so we're kind of looking at it and trying to say across the portfolio of our stores, should we be focusing less on a cafe if that's not where the money is and if that's not what the behavior is following? So that those are conversations. We don't have the answer to it, and it's not always the same. It's different in every market, but it's not a place that we thought we would be a year ago. So it's interesting conversation, to say the least.
Yeah, or maybe the cafe is not 90% indoor and 10% outdoor, but it's 90% outdoor and 10% indoor.
Exactly.
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
I was just going to add that I think if nothing else, this pandemic has shed light on how impactful our environment actually is on our health and well-being. And so even though right now a lot of the focus is on improving air quality or reducing contact with surfaces or reducing the spread of respiratory droplets between people, I do think that individuals, both in their work, but also in their home offices, are starting to pay attention to how their environment is impacting their health, well-being, and productivity. I mean, how many people on the line now have experienced acoustical issues related to Zoom calls? We now know sort of like what the materials in our room are doing to contribute to acoustics. Similarly, light quality or even ergonomics. People are moving less because they're not commuting, and we're sort of starting to realize how the furniture is impacting the way our body feels. And so I think that when we can stop the bleeding, if you will, and we are no longer dealing with this pandemic, I do believe that it will be behind us at some point, that we will have the space at least to start considering some of the other ways to truly optimize our environment. It's less about stopping the crisis and more about focusing on prevention and or enabling people to thrive.
Yeah, being adaptable and flexible for the next thing, whatever that is. And Jessica, I want to thank you because without prompting, you led right into, I'm just going to segue into the Q&A section. And one of the attendees asked, about climate change, right? And what efforts you all are taking at a minimum in every project to help lessen the impact of your built spaces. And this is above and beyond the minimum regulations, because, that is a huge unseen impact of design. Do you want to continue to speak to that, Jessica, or would anyone else like to pipe in?
Yeah, I mean, I can start, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally believe that environmental health and human health are inextricably linked. And so in all of our work, we try to promote both sustainable design that's good for the environment, as well as design that's focused on human health and well-being. And we have a number of different ways that we guide clients through that conversation and that journey. But, you know, I mean, my journey with Well started from a place of recognizing that you can't have truly optimized human health outcomes unless you're also thinking about better supporting the environment and understanding what is contributing to climate change, and how we as designers and building operators can help prevent against climate change. We have to set performance metrics for air quality because the environment is being polluted, and that's bad for us and it's bad for the environment. Similarly, from a water quality perspective. So looking at ways to optimize energy efficiency, water efficiency, zero waste design alongside design that promotes human health is critical. And there's some really inspiring projects that have been successful in that, achieving WELL Platinum outcomes, as well as Living Building Challenge and sort of getting to net zero, or achieving LEED Platinum with their WELL Platinum. So it's definitely possible when you start with both goals in mind, environmental health and human health, to design for both. If you ignore one and try to do the other later, you're going to find conflicts that are either going to be expensive or really difficult to overcome. So, you know, I think just starting with that more holistic view is the best place.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I want to touch on in this question. The first is around the built environment. I remember learning really early on in my career, kind of, you know, a mind-blowing moment of how much of the impact of building in the construction industry has on our CO2 emissions, or just in general, like how much it impacts our earth in a really negative way. And so I started to, I think, subconsciously make the shift of, instead of wanting to be the architect that designs and builds these big brand new skyscrapers, to really think strategically about how we can look at some of the infrastructure that we already have and start to go in and adapt and reuse and retrofit to new uses in a more thoughtful way, both to the environment but also to the building. There's some really beautiful buildings in the world that I think are overlooked because maybe they're a little bit run down. But to me, I look at something like that and it's almost as though it's artwork, and it needs a little bit of a facelift, or it needs just a little bit of love. And then instead of having all those resources to tear it down and build something new, you have this opportunity to create something in this impactful environment already that sits on that land, that is part of that community. The second thing that I want to touch on comes from this research that I did earlier on in my career with a couple landscape architects after Hurricane Sandy hit New York and Boston. And we started to do this research about, you know, what are the solutions of what we can do for the built environment, or for the urban environment, or the landscape environment, to, you know, stop storm surge or stop sea level rise. And what we obviously realized is that there aren't necessarily solutions, but there are strategies. And I think that if we just make that shift of, instead of saying we're going to solve for this with one thing, and start to think about, well, here are the different strategies that we've understood have positive impacts, but may also have some negative impacts. And then we have this network that every single project we start with, we can look at that arsenal of tools that we now have and say, all right, well, this site, you know, it could really be impactful if we have a soft edge rather than putting a seawall. And this is because X, Y, and Z based off of the research. Or maybe another building site, it will say, you know what, this is going to be great. This is going to have a great impact if we move all of the mechanical up to the roof and allow for the first floor to just be blown out when the storm hits. And we're not going to put anything on that first floor that's going to get damaged. So you're starting to like kind of push and pull with Mother Earth and say, you know, we're going to allow you to do this because we know we can't stop it. And just, again, going in with the patience of knowing that every time there's going to be a big storm, that 100-year storm is now happening, you know, every 10, 15 years, if not more frequent than that. And so how are we understanding that and thinking about that when we're designing these buildings or these spaces?
Yeah, so you're really speaking to designing with strategy in mind rather than static solutions, not making a promise that
Because it
this
has to
one
change.
solution, yeah, because change is inevitable. There, someone asked a question, and I think this is a good lead into that, about the fact that everyone is confused out there. I love the realness of this question. Like, we're all confused out here in regard to the constantly changing policies for how people can interact in business, both inside and outside, and what that looks like. Because we learn something new every day. This is an ever evolving situation where we don't know what we don't know. And then when it becomes revealed, we have to adapt again, adapt again. So how are you guys thinking about the constantly changing policies that, even though we know it's probably going to change again tomorrow, you have to design for today, right? You have to put it in there. So would you like to talk about that, Riz, or anyone else? I go with whoever's on my screen first.
I feel like I'm talking a lot. I'm going to let someone else.
Who else? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, flexibility, I think, is something that we're all having to focus on a lot more. And in my case, it's not something that I'm always a big fan of. I think in a space like Starbucks, which is kind of publicly owned, I have the tendency to want everything to be in its place all the time. And that doesn't allow for flexibility. So my like ideal Starbucks is where everything's bolted to the floor, and there's everything is anchored and in the right place, and that's never how it happens. And now we're really having to embrace and think about, all right, we quite literally have to go to like a lot of two top tables and know that people are going to gang them together if they want to have a big group, and they're going to separate them if we don't have that many people in the store, if we can't. And my instinct does not go that way, but we're making it work. And we're trying to think a lot about how we can define zones architecturally to kind of dictate where furniture should be so that people aren't moving it, even though it is movable. So we're thinking a little bit more on how we can do that as a brand, to give some sort of like subliminal direction to say, don't move this here. But obviously in a way that isn't going to limit you in the future if in 5 or 10 years you renovate and you want to change layout of seating or the patio or whatnot. So quite literally, it's just us choosing a flexible option. But I think the benefit is we're getting pushed out of our comfort zone, and it's forcing you to think differently to control the thing that you can't control.
No, I think too, oh, sorry.
No, go, please, go ahead.
I think too that us all being designers, we really are flexible people. I mean, we come in with this grand idea for a project that starts up here, then the budget shock comes here, then the client changes their mind, then there's this, and here's the final design. And it still comes out to be something so beautiful. I mean, we're flexible along the way. And I kind of think that if with this whole pandemic and dealing with the changes that one day we got to have 6 feet apart, one day only 2 people in the waiting room, we're kind of the good ones that are able to adapt to that in a sense. Like, okay, this is all right, this is the 12th hour or 13th hour, and you want us to rearrange this. We do it all the time, if you think about it, in many of our projects. So yes, this is a little bit scary now, but I also think these are the challenges we kind of signed up.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think designers are natural problem solvers and innovative thinkers as well. And I think there are a lot of opportunities, especially right now, but over the long term too. So often I think designers get brought in to design the project, see it get implemented and built, and then they're told that their job is done. And there's so much good use for design and more of a continuous improvement type of environment to continue to monitor what's working, what's not working, and to innovate as you learn how people are utilizing the space and or how the space needs to flex with whatever might be going on. And I actually think it'll be really interesting to see, especially in workplace, which is more flexible than say a healthcare healthcare environment that has to serve a specific purpose no matter what's going on, but what is the future of workplace? And what happens to our offices after an extended period of time with people working from home? Do our offices change in terms of what they function for and why people come to them, and what they can nurture when people come to them? So I think designers are going to play a key role in that, just because we are natural problem solvers and will come up with really innovative ways to repurpose what's existing in a most optimized way.
So now, speaking of that, let's think about company culture and about the fact that a lot of places, when they do go back to the office, they won't be back in the numbers that they are, right? Um, and a lot of people are, some people want to go back to the office, others don't. You know, many people want flex opportunities. How do designers help to support company culture when there aren't as many people coming back into the company itself? How are we looking at that, my architect and design panel?
I have an interesting perspective on that, because we just got a big announcement last week where Starbucks told us that we would not go back till October 2021. And the reason they said that is Kevin Johnson, our CEO, said, you know, is basing it off of the availability of a vaccine at scale, and then a buffer. And he was hitting kind of 9 or 10 months earliest. And so they just decided, we're not going to kick the can down the road. We're going to tell you a year, but what we're going to do is we're going to renovate the offices while no one is in it. And I thought that was an incredibly smart way to go about things. And so they're proactively taking the time when we're not there to create the space and make it how we're going to need it to be for however many people choose to come back and what capacity they come back. And, you know, they're tapping into internal design people within Starbucks. And so I loved that they took that approach personally. That can be really scary for a lot of people. But I think design is going to become more and more important, just because there's going to be just so many more questions and things that we need to figure out and problem solve within shared space, regardless of whether it's an office or not. And, you know, there are companies like Notel that do really interesting work with short-term leases and shared office space is kind of how they started. That I think we're going to start to see a rise in those types of companies, or at least the demand for a short-term lease for a smaller company, or for, you know, groups of employees who want to be in an office. So I think we'll play a larger role.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a lot internally, especially. I mean, we've been talking about this with our clients, I think, since March, maybe even before that. And there's, you know, we don't know yet, right? Like this is back to adaptability. This is constantly changing. We're constantly learning new things. And I think that we all need to be patient with what those strategies are, and also understand that design is supposed to evolve. I mean, this is why we're all here, is because we want to be part of the evolution of how, you know, how architecture has been in the last 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, and then how we're going to move it into this next wave, whether it's with an impact of sustainability, or an impact of wellness, or an impact of new building materials and new typologies. You know, we're thinking about it through these lenses of innovation, both for our clients, but also for the, you know, the physical space and the physical objects within that space. And so for me, when I think about workplace in the future, post-pandemic or in the pandemic world, it's, you know, it's not what we knew maybe, but it's also not gone. We still need places where we can innovate together. We still need places where we can meet together. We work with a lot of companies that have an activity-based working system set in place, and they're already kind of thinking about that already. Even before this, you do your individual work in one place, you do your group work in another place in the space. Maybe you need to take a phone call, so you sit in a lounge chair, right? So you have all of your different work points. And now, instead of the work points being in your, you know, interior workplace space, they've now scattered throughout whatever city, or even globally, of how you're moving through to all of these different areas of the world or of the city, whether it's be at your home or be at a Starbucks or be at your office space, for all of those different interactions. And that's what really excites me, because I think that it allows us, again, as thought leaders, to talk about this in a bigger way and actually have a bigger voice, maybe because people are going to hear us and hear these ideas with new ears based off of what's happening.
Thank you for that. And we are just a little over time. So I just want to just say, going with the thought leaders, I think we all forget that in our own, no matter your role, no matter the size of your world or your bubble, we're all thought leaders in our own right. So I hope that, thanks to our wonderful panelists, I hope that everyone joining us today has something that they feel they've gained here, that they can go out and they can share and lead and affect some positive change in your own world, no matter how big or small. So thank you for staying over with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thanks everyone so much for your participation. I feel kind of evil stopping the conversation here because there's still a bunch of questions. But the good news about that is that we are going to do an encore show, if you will, follow-up event on Instagram Live with Melissa. And so we can dive a little deeper into some of these unanswered questions. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for your participation in today's conversation. This was just above and beyond what I was expecting. It was so lovely. And Melissa, thank you so much for your efforts in making this a wonderful event as well. And I also just wanted to thank Sarah McNally, our VP of City Centers, for her dedication and encouragement in helping me put this together today. So thank you so much. And then in closing, just a little bit of future thinking here. I won't read this entire list because we're a bit over, but I just wanted to share a few upcoming virtual events that IIDA SoCal has put together. So next week on the 14th, our Pro-D committee has put together a resume tips and tricks presentation. On the 20th, the LA City Center has put together a recipe for design, which is going to be super fun. On the 29th, we're doing an event called Keep Your Cool, Tips to Maintain Grace and Mindfulness Through Challenging Times. And then the date is actually wrong on this, and that's my fault. But on the 30th of October, we will be announcing the winners of our Virtual Student Design Expo. Submissions are actually due tomorrow. So if there are any students on the line, you still have about 24 hours to submit some work. Go to iidasocal.org to find the event registration for that. So again, thank you so much. Sorry for going a little over, but I hope everyone has a really great night. Thanks.